YouTube, what is good? It's your man Ribs from Doing Film Things. So today we're going to talk about this right here. This is Kodak Tmax 400. I think this is one of the most controversial films. And controversial might be kind of an aggressive word, but basically, this film basically has extreme haters or extreme lovers. And it's really hard to figure out kind of a middle ground here. I feel like you really can't just stay in the middle and appreciate it and use it. You kind of have to love it or hate it. And the reason is because this film is often compared to TriX 400, which of course is the classic Kodak emulsion for black and white. And TriX is the historical one that kind of came out in the 50s and was used by all the famous photojournalists. And so many of the most important photos that have existed in the history of photography were shot on that particular film. So there's a huge legacy there. And then Kodak kind of came out with this. And this came out in 1986 originally. And it's supposed to be kind of the high-end professional grade black and white film for Kodak, meaning super fine grain, great latitude, good contrast, all of the above. And generally, I feel like this film does fulfill that, and it actually, does exactly what it says it's gonna do. The grain is there, but it's super nice and like clean and kind of milky. Contrast-wise, I really like what this film does in terms of the high end and the low end. And then, of course, just latitude. It's black and white film. You know the drill. But nonetheless, a lot of people do not like this film. So I wanted to use this film. I shot 2 rolls, and I just wanted to see what my impressions were. This is not a very technical overview. We're not going to dive into and do kind of like all these exposure tests and all that stuff. This is more about just my impressions of using it and the results that I got. So first and foremost, I think the main thing to talk about with this film, or at least the first thing to talk about, is the grain. So this is billed as the world's sharpest grain at 400 ISO for black and white. And I feel like that's true. What does sharp grain mean? Well, in this case, it means that you get tons of detail without some overbearing, kind of aggressive, very in-your-face grain. This is ISO 400 film, which means you still are going to see grain, but this reminds me of what you see with Portra, for example, Portra 400, where the grain is obviously there. It's a 400 speed film, you can't avoid it, but it's really nicely integrated into the overall image. And if you're looking for something that's quote-unquote clean and very kind of high-end, especially for portraits, this film does that, and it does it very well. I've got a couple of examples here that we can look at. And these are all prints that I made in the darkroom yesterday. Kind of went crazy and printed an insane amount of pictures. But this is one of my first portraits here. This is an 8x10 from a 35mm negative. And on this picture right here, if you kind of zoom in and look at the details, you'll see that there's definitely grain happening in here. But it's kind of, let's say, I'm going to say mushy, but I don't mean that in a bad way. I kind of mean that in a good way, if it sounds appropriate. But the point is that the grain is soft and it kind of blends into the image and it's not overbearing. And I don't mind grain. I actually love grain. I think the harsher, the better in many cases. But in the case of doing something that's quote unquote clean and has a nice finish and has a professional appeal, the grain on here definitely delivers that. And you can zoom into the eyes here. You can kind of look at the detail. The grain is evident, but it's not these harsh dots. The grain kind of just blends in. And we talk about grain. This is T grain on the emulsion. And without getting too scientific, because I'm not the expert here, the T grain style of emulsion basically allows you to get significant more detail and more use of the silver that's going into the film, as opposed to the classic, which is called cubic. TriX is done on cubic, and this is done on T grain. And every kind of big company has one or the other, or has both, I should say. Like Ilford has Delta versus HP5, and that distinguishes between T grain and cubic. And this one, same thing. But yeah, grain wise, I think that looks really nice. And then I kind of want to look at this one here as well. This print right here is another quote unquote portrait, but it's a street photo. I just took this while walking. This crop that you see here is actually not the real crop of the image. I'll show the real image here. That's the digital scan, and you can see there's a lot more information. I actually decided I didn't like the word Iceland on there because it really kind of dates the photo, and you can tell that it's a supermarket, whatever. So when I printed it, I actually zoomed in quite a bit, crop, let's say. I don't know what percentage, but I'm in here pretty good if you compare this to the scan. And when you look at this photo and you kind of look at the details, typically when you crop like this with a film that's super grainy, the grain is just going to become extremely evident and maybe perhaps messy and distracting. In this case, the grain hasn't done anything to this image. The grain is just as soft as you would see it on a normal crop. And that's actually where I think this film really shines, is that, again, it's a kind of professional film when it comes to portraiture and when it comes to just, let's say, fashion and beauty, that kind of stuff. So the grain doesn't take away from this image. It doesn't distract. It just kind of exists there, and it's this nice subtle touch. And I'm super impressed here. You zoom in and you look at this image, And of course you can tell that there's grain here, but it's not those dots. You're not seeing specific little kind of like pinpoints. It's a very kind of blended and integrated grain. And it's super impressive. It's a bit more obvious as you look up here in kind of the shadowy area that has less light. And I burned this as well. That's why it's so dark around the edges. I wanted to really make her stick out. But even here, you can see the grain, of course. But again, it's not dots. It kind of has a soft touch to it, which I appreciate. We can look at one more image here. And that's this image right here. And this is of a car. This also is another kind of aggressive crop. Not as aggressive as the portrait that I showed you, but it is crop nonetheless. And there's just so much detail. This film is sharp. And I think that's the other thing to talk about with this film. Sharpness is one of the key features of this film. And if you're going for ultimate detail, you want to make use of a high-res scanner that's going to give you the most bang for your buck. This film is a great one to use because it really does resolve details very, very nicely. You've got a grate here, you've got the letters, you've got texture within the lights. There's just texture everywhere on here, and it's very, very evident without being like clinical, let's say. Because again, this is film, and you're never going to get clinical with film the way you do with digital. So sharpness and grain, I think those are the two extreme highlights of this. The thing that really gets controversial with people is apparently there's an issue with this film where it doesn't resolve highlights well. And what I mean by that is that people get blown out highlights if they don't meter appropriately. I'm not totally sure I'm convinced of this, but looking at some of my images, I feel like there's a potential that that might be the case. A couple images like these right here, you can see that my highlights are just kind of gone. The sky is completely white there. And I wasn't extremely careful when exposing these. I did have my Sekonic meter, just kind of pointing it into the sky. So I was metering, I wasn't guessing, but I wasn't being extremely kind of technical with it. The point is, it looks like all the detail in the sky here is gone. And from what I remember, there was detail in the sky. There was clouds and there was some texture. It wasn't, extremely kind of this amazing cloud display, but there should be texture in the sky here from what I remember. So I'm not sure what's going on. I want to shoot this film a bit more because, for landscapes and stuff like that, which is something that I do enjoy doing, I'm curious if this is the film that I would use. And a lot of people say, yes, that's the one you should use. But other people say, no. Other people say you should go for one of the Ilford brands or maybe even use TriX, even though obviously that's going to introduce a completely different look. So, I don't know. I'm curious. Have you had any experience with this film in terms of the highlights? Is that criticism correct? Let me know in the comments. Do you find that this film kind of doesn't handle highlights well for some reason? So, all in all, though, I really appreciate this film. I definitely enjoyed shooting it. I love the output that I got from it. I really like the contrast that this film gives. It really kind of gives you this beautiful, high-end and low-end contrast where you can really play with that a lot. And I actually bumped up the contrast a lot in these prints. As you know, I have a color enlarger, but with a color enlarger, if you manipulate the green and blue colors, and of course there's no green in the enlarger settings, nor is there blue, but you can manipulate that with your other knobs. The point is, if you play in either one of those spectrums, you either increase contrast or decrease. The more blue you have, the more contrast, and the more green you have, the less contrast. So I actually went a bit aggressive here in adding kind of blue into this image, and the contrast just became very evident. Like this photo right here, I decided to go very aggressive with it, and I also did some cropping here, and then of course did some vignetting just to like really darken some of these corners. But I love how much texture you get in here, and the contrast that comes out, just really nice. And again, the grain is really nice here. It's there, you can see it, but it's nice and soft. It's almost subtle in a certain way, especially for a 400 speed film, which a lot of the other 400 speed films that I've used in the past don't have this subtle of a grain. So I just really like this film. But to be fair, I've never shot TriX, so literally never. So I'm gonna invest in TriX, and I think hopefully here in London, once kind of lockdown eases, hopefully potentially the next 2 weeks, we'll see. I'll get out a lot more and put some TriX to use because I'm really curious to see what those results are. And that is the classic film. It's got the legacy. It's got all the fanboys, fangirls, and I want to know if that's for good reason. I think I am going to like it because apparently there's a bit more evident, slightly harsher grain, and there's a different kind of contrast going on. So that sounds interesting to me. I don't know. Sometimes I get lost in black and white and it's hard to tell the difference between any of them. But in this case, apparently there's a real big difference. So I'm going to go ahead and try that. But last question, what do you think between Tmax and TriX? Do you have a personal preference for the 400 speed? Let me know in the comments. All right, y'all. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoyed these prints too. I definitely enjoyed making all these prints. Like, look at this one right here. This one's pretty interesting. I got pretty aggressive again with the contrast and the burning and all that stuff to try to make something a bit moody. I think I could have gotten even a bit more because I didn't want any texture in the guy's clothes or anything like that. But nonetheless, I'm definitely going to keep doing some printing, and overall, really happy with Tmax. So if you enjoyed this video, please go ahead and leave me a like, and of course, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss other videos about printing and black and white and anything film related, because that's what I talk about here. All right, y'all, until the next video, peace.